Hi there. In this lecture we see Boris Spassky against Tigran Petrosian in the 1966 Petrosian-Spassky World Championship match. This is round 7. So d4 from Boris Spassky. We see knight f6, knight f3, e6, bishop g5. So a Torre attack. d5, knight bd2. So it's a little bit like the London system, but the bishop on g5 makes a big difference. I once had a debate with Paul Georgiou about this. It makes a huge difference. He's a Torre attack fan. Rather than bishop being on f4, well, I can still set up a triangle. So it's kind of related. You could say the opening has a kind of family resemblance to the London system. Now, in this position, Tigran Petrosian does not castle kingside. He actually plays a pretty useful move, c5. This gives some options as well as adding some pressure to the centre. If white's not careful, white can fall into c4. So white has to be a bit careful as well. c3 is played. So we have that classic kind of solid triangle. b6. Now, again, delaying kingside castling. So black is giving the option now of castling potentially queenside once the queen moves. We see actually knight e5 here, and interestingly now Petrosian does take that, d takes, knight d7, the bishop goes to f4, and now queen c7. And in fact, hold on a sec, isn't black able to sort of use the bishop for a tempo gainer and maybe play like a really attacking game, inviting an opposite side castling scenario? We see knight f3, which deprives g5, but now h6. Bishop g3, and now, in fact, even though the bishop's moved there in advance of g5, g5 is played anyway. The funny thing about this position is that Petrosian's king is pretty safe. We see b4, and now h5, threatening h4 to crunch that bishop. So h4 is played by white. If b takes c5, just to put it on the board, h4, where is the bishop going? If c takes, we're going to win that bishop with advantage. So h4 is played, but this opens up now a road to the king. But of course these pawns are doubled, but on the other hand there's e5 pressure as well. Bishop f4 is played. If bishop takes h4, then there's the neglect of the e5 pawn, and we can actually just take on h4, take on e5 with the queen. And, you know, this is great for black castling queenside. It's really great, looking forward to this road to the king. We see bishop f4 holding on to e5. Black castles queenside. And it's a really safe looking position. This is pretty solid, but also aggressive. There are winning prospects. Clear winning prospects, because we've got a road to the king. We see a4. And now keeping things close, c4. Bishop e2, now a very interesting prophylaxis move. So against a5 or b5 and a5, what would you play here for 100 prophylaxis points? Positional prophylaxis points. Very distinct points. I haven't given them out before. I think we should start giving them out here. So black to play, what would you play? There might be some concerns of an attack by the highly feared Boris Spassky. Okay, I'm about to reveal a6. It means that we can answer a5 with b5. It also means we can answer b5, let's use blue, with a5, keeping everything closed. Brilliant prophylaxis move. So king h1, and now using that lovely road to the king, rook dg8. Now the concession, there is a concession of sorts, the d4 square. But it's not that exploitable because the e5 pawn is vulnerable to be taken. And if that's taken out later, maybe f6 and later e5, and opening up this bishop to actually pin things on the diagonal. So white has to be careful. We see this passive looking move. Spassky is doomed to passivity, it seems here. Rook g4, black meanwhile is building up the rooks. Queen d2, the rooks are built up. What a miserable position for white. a5, b5, that's the end of white's attack. This king is so snug and cozy on c8 here. We see rook ad1, And now bishop f8, revealing perhaps, bishop g7 later, and yeah, more pressure on e5. And if the queen comes in, maybe a bit of preparation, queen d8, f6, and then this bishop can be liberated across that diagonal, maybe pinning stuff. So we see knight h2. This is a bit desperate, this move. It does weaken e5. So guess what Petrosian plays here? Okay, Petrosian actually uses an exchange sacrifice. It does straighten out the pawns, and it's like converting a g file into a mass of pawns here, which are really, really dangerous in their own right. So why did white do knight h2? Before we carry on there, if queen c2, let's give an example of what might happen. Black might put more pressure on e5, and white can cling on just about using the d4 square, but let's say queen d8, and then there's the potential for f6, and this will start to mean e5 is now on the cards. For example, here wins a piece. So what does what does white do here? If bishop h2, then h3, and we can get a real pin potential. An absolute pin is often worth more than a relative pin, and we're going to get it here. Look, we've got the absolute pin now of that knight against the king. It's absolute when it's against the king rather than any other piece, and this means that it's a huge attacking potential. Putting more pressure on f3. It's immobilized. Black's easily going to be winning this position. So okay, so that's if white does nothing. So even though it does have basically a weakness for the last move, it was a bad position anyway. So okay, this exchange sacrifice, it's used to straighten out the pawns, and it does mean actually that this bishop is still on the lookout for joining with other forces to rip through this diagonal. We see e4 trying to disrupt the black structure, but in fact Petrosian is not interested in that at all, in taking that pawn at this moment. He plays actually bishop d6. We have queen e3, and now knight d7. Pair of bishops come off, rook d4, e5, rook d2, and now a really powerful move. It is about the bishop to a large extent, to try and liberate it, and about the pawns. For 100 points here, what do you think black plays in this position? It's a real undermining move, but also tactical to try and get that absolute pin, at least against g2 would be good. So okay, this move, f5, putting more pressure on white's center. We have e takes d5. If e takes f5, then knight f6, and this position d4, and we're opening up the bishop, we're starting to pin stuff potentially, and e4 as an example is starting to get really nasty for white. This situation, that bishop's really active. There's things like knight g3 potentially. If here h3, it starts to get really vicious. So this would be great for black. This position is a wealth of opportunity for black. So e takes d5 is played, and we see f4, queen e4. Then there aren't that many great options, so the queen tries to stick around. Knight f6, queen f5 check, king b8, but we can get a tempo game potentially on that diagonal, potentially, and Petrosian does. Bishop c8, queen goes back, and now another wonderful move. Okay, g3, yeah, with the idea that these pawns are really squishing. So that's a big kind of form pawn now on g3. We see rook e1, h3, bishop f1, rook h8, g takes h3, bishop takes h3, king g1. This h file seems very dangerous. Bishop takes f1, king takes f1. A very nice master touch here now. For 100 points, what would you play here? Brilliant little touch here. To try and make more than one passed pawn. So at the moment there's one passed pawn. Can we make it two connected passed pawns as the motive for this next move? Okay, it's actually e4. Wonderful move. So queen d1 is played. If rook takes e4, then we can just win the queen. If f takes e4, we get two connected passed pawns with an immediate threat of rook h1 mating. The pawns take away the escape squares. If king g1, queen f4, this is quite vicious. One have to give up a rook because the threats are too much to bear, like queen h4 and other threats. And if white has to give up a rook, then white's just a knight down for not much. It's crushing. So, okay, queen d1 was tried. And now another master touch. Really wonderful stuff in this game. Black to play here. What do you think? Petrosian played here. Okay. Knight g4. Absolutely amazing move. Absolutely amazing. So offering up the knight to get two connected passed pawns. The knight's really vicious there. And he's taken out f3. So we're now threatening rook h1. Checkmate. We see rook g2. So just to put that on the board, if rook takes e4, rook h1 is checkmate. So rook g2. F takes g2. And this ends the game. Spassky resigned here. If king takes g2, then check. And queen h6 is going to be absolutely winning. For example, check and mate. And instead of king takes g2, if king e2, then queen f4 is really vicious. For example, here, queen d4, queen f3 check. And we can even get the queens off to get this position where the king's gone far away but left these dangerous passed pawns behind. So that will be winning. So yes, a wonderful game. Very little risk, it seems, for black's king in this game. Making systematic advances, getting a formidable attacking position against the great Boris Spassky, who is a fantastic player, of course, and world champion in later years, who challenged Bobby Fischer. So yeah, a really kind of one-way game. The counterplay of white was kept to an absolute minimum. Black was building up and building up. Fantastic game. That's how it's done. That's a model Petrosian game. Quite often the World Championship games of these great players do echo their major playing style and strengths. And this was a great advert for Tigran Petrosian's chess. I think one takeaway point is that the cozy bishop also wanted to be a formidable attacking weapon on the diagonal. So some of the advances are to do with creating connected passed pawn potential, but they're also connected with trying to liberate that bishop as a formidable attacking weapon. So it had solidity and it had aggression. It had two ingredients here, which makes it more like a kind of one-way victory, the way it was turned out. Yeah, there's some inaccuracies from Boris Spassky early on in this game, which gave black a really pleasant plan straight out of the opening. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Okay. Thanks very much.